With the election of Nelson Mandela, many started talking about the new South Africa. And that was, in fact, a slogan that really caught on and persisted all through the rest of the 1990s. To some extent, this was superficial, or rather, there were superficial elements to this. Some of the symbols of South Africa were altered. This was the new flag. You can see that the black, yellow, and green, which were the ANC colors, were incorporated into it, but the red, the white, and the blue were in a way a nod to the old South Africa, right? So this is a coming together of people. Those were all colors in the old flag, and South Africa. Mandela himself began to use the rhetoric of South Africa being the rainbow nation, right? A nation where all different ethnicities and races of people come together, that they create a beautiful rainbow out of all of this, and then the very colorful flag, new flag of South Africa, was part of that. There was an altered national anthem, the Nguni hymn, Nkosi Sikelele Africa, was made into the national anthem, but then there was a portion of the old South African national anthem, Die Stem van Suid-Afrika, that was added on to the end of that, as well as a portion of an English song, to represent all groups of people. But this slogan of the New South Africa was not just about these symbols of the country. There was also a tremendous amount of optimism among blacks especially, but even among many whites, that this was a new page in the history of South Africa, that this was going to be a better situation for them, that the specter of apartheid was no longer going to be the source of so much unrest. And a lot of this confidence was placed in Mandela himself. He was almost universally respected. Of course, he did have his critics among all groups of people. He was not so popular among Afrikaners in particular, but at times they gave him respect and even lauded him for some of the things that he did. And so Mandela, the force of his personality, is what drove much of the optimism of the new South Africa. But there were a lot of obstacles in the way of real progress. Yes, now South Africa was a democracy, but on the other hand, South Africa also faced serious continued racial divisions that came from the white dominance, and some of this was protected by the sunset clauses of the interim constitution, or rather the government of national unity arrangement. Whites continued to control the vast majority of money and wealth. The economy in general was mostly in white hands. The judiciary, which at times blocked Mandela's attempts to get things done, and in general was an opponent all through his presidency, remained largely in white hands, not least because it was difficult to find trained judges and even lawyers who were black Africans, given that apartheid had limited opportunities to learn such things. The government bureaucracy remained and was almost entirely in white hands, and the apartheid government had a very bloated bureaucracy, had multiple kind of overlapping or parallel departments, and this was especially true for things like education, where it was just completely unwieldy. And so Mandela, he didn't want to alienate the white population. He was a reconciler, someone who was intent, more than almost anything else, on bringing people together, right? He was a uniter. And so, he wasn't just going to come in and clean house with the bureaucracy and the judiciary, and the Constitution limited his ability to do some of these things anyway. But this meant that some of these things, like the bloated bureaucracy, were never fully solved, and the attempts to put blacks and colors and Indians and people who had been locked out of government positions into government agencies really just bloated the bureaucracy even more, and in some cases created serious obstacles to help the country progress, to helping the country progress. The army and the police were controlled by whites, even though the police force was probably, even at the end of apartheid, about 60% black. The black policemen were often very unpopular. They were seen as collaborators, and so they were not the best agents for change. And the vast majority of all officers in the police force were white, and so it was very much under the control of the white population. And the same went for the army. The tens of thousands of fighters for Mkhonto we Sizwe and the other militant organizations were there were attempts to incorporate them into the army, but it's a very different situation to go from being trained in these training camps in other countries in Africa, essentially in the bush, because they have to be very secretive, to becoming a disciplined force in the army, or for that matter in the police. And so, this was the incorporation of non-whites into things like the army and the police, especially into the officer corps of those organizations, was extremely difficult. A measure of both the challenges that Mandela faced and the inability of the Mandela administration to make real progress in some of the most meaningful ways that he might have is the Human Development Index. This is something kept by the United Nations. In 1994, South Africa ranked about 90th out of 175 countries, so right in the middle of the Human Development Index. And it should be said that the main reason why they ranked so high was that the white population had a similar standard of living to any country in Western Europe, or in fact even the United States. But the vast majority of non-whites, and especially blacks, lived in severe poverty. So if it hadn't been for the white population kind of bringing the averages up, they would have been much lower. Great efforts were made, or at least there was a lot of rhetoric and a lot of planning and things like this to address poverty, but so monumental was the task. I mean, we're transitioning here from a government that did almost nothing to alleviate poverty, and in fact thrived on blacks remaining in poverty and being willing to work at jobs for wages that were barely at survival level, to now a government that was intent on bringing opportunities to all of the people of South Africa. But there were lots of economic headwinds to this. There in the 1990s, even though worldwide in general it was a pretty good decade economically, this is especially true for the United States. But there was a market collapse in the mid-1990s in Asia, which affected Africa, and South Africa suffered from that. By the end of the decade, South Africa was back in recession. It had grown, though very slow. The economy had grown very slowly over the course of Mandela's presidency until the last year, and then it kind of hit a wall. The education system. So, one of the probably the best way to combat poverty, of course, is to give people opportunities via education. But the education system in South Africa was absolutely broken. Black children were educated in substandard schools. I had some personal experience with this, when I lived there during the Mandela presidency. The organization I worked for operated at times in schools. I even helped teachers in schools a few times, and these were in townships, and the windows of these school classrooms were often broken. The toilet facilities, the bathrooms were absolutely atrocious, just foul places. The lack of textbooks, and maybe the worst problem was the simple lack of training and qualifications of the teachers. Far less than half of the teachers in black schools were qualified, had any credentials at all. And this is just not conducive to a productive education for people who have lacked opportunities. Mandela and his administration did make serious efforts to try to address this, but South African students still tended to score abysmally on standardized tests. Very, very low percentages, especially of black students, were able to pass matriculation examinations. And I saw government efforts at this too. I had some friends who were in high. I was only 20 years old myself. I had friends who were still in high school while I was there, and uh, they had like television programs that the government sponsored of teachers on there, helping students review for their exams. I remember one buddy I had, his name was Esau. He, watched these things religiously. He was desperate to get into a university, and he actually succeeded. I believe ended up going to the University of Pretoria. But the education system was really flawed, and this one even went for the universities. There was under apartheid, there'd been a system where there were black designated universities. These were again staffed by largely underqualified faculty members, and the resources were very slim. In some cases, they were run by corrupt administrations. The government put a lot of pressure on the more prestigious universities like Wits in Cape Town and Free State University and these other places too, and Stellenbosch, to take more black students, but changes were slow. So education was an area that was never fully addressed. Another challenge, another obstacle was that there had been a lot of immigration from surrounding countries into South Africa because of the instability of those countries and the perceived availability of jobs in the mines and industry and things like that. And this was especially true for Johannesburg, though the other major cities had large numbers of people from Central Africa and other parts of Southern Africa. I spent a fair amount of time in Johannesburg, and even though I was not stationed in Hillbrow itself, which is of course the neighborhood featured in Paswane Umpe's novel, which is a sign for this week. But the mention of Makwere by Umpe in this novel, right? These are immigrants. These are people from outside of South Africa, foreigners, and there was a great deal of xenophobia, fear, even among the black South Africans, right? They saw these people as interlopers, as people coming and taking jobs and introducing kind of foreign corruption. The conflicts in other parts of Africa in the 1990s spilled over into the inner city of Johannesburg. The Rwandan genocide in 1994 meant that there were lots and lots of refugees. There already had been actually, but that number increased from Central Africa into South Africa, and these people lived in small and very dilapidated flats or apartment buildings in central Johannesburg, and the ethnic conflicts that marked other parts of Africa were often carried over into South Africa, right? So lots of Congolese, lots of Rwandans, lots of people from Burundi lived in Ponte Tower, which is this high-rise 54-story block of flats in central Johannesburg, which was really just sort of a township in a skyscraper itself, right? So, this immigration did destabilize, especially the urban environments, a great deal. Violence and crime in the 1990s, and in fact thereafter, was at crisis levels in South Africa. The murder rate in South Africa was among the highest in the world, and the rate of other violent crimes easily outpaced every other country in the world. Carjackings were incredibly common. Car thieves got really good at literally stealing the car out from underneath you, right? I worked for an organization that had a fleet of vehicles, about 60 or 70 of them, I think. And during the 2 years that I worked for this religious organization, 12 of our vehicles were stolen. Um, 6 of them, I believe, were at gunpoint. The others were taken, stolen in other ways, usually robbed at night when they were unmonitored. And these thieves were incredibly good at getting these vehicles. One, well, the one that really stands out to me is our organization had what was called a combi, which is kind of a minibus. These things are worth their weight in gold because the main source of transportation between the townships and the central part of Johannesburg, or sort of all over these cities, and this is true not just for Johannesburg, but pretty much every place I went, because the black population tended to live in these townships that had been removed. They had these mini bus taxis that would fit, in some cases, like 20 people inside. I rode in these things on a fairly frequent basis and ended up smashed in between all sorts of people. It was a great cultural experience, I will say. Though you definitely, if you have problems with personal space, you didn't want to do this. But our organization had a combi, right? Now, these things are, as I said, they're worth their weight in gold. You can make a lot of money running taxi service if you have a combi. This combi was inside of a locked gate with hydraulics on the gate. So this wasn't just like a chained gate. It actually had, hydraulic opening system. It had a steering wheel lock on it, a big club thing that locked it in place. It had what was called a petrol switch, which was a thing under the dash that you would flip, and if somebody tried to steal the car, then the gas would actually cut out to the engine, and the engine would stall within just driving a few feet. And I believe it was even like chained to a pole or something like that. This was at the residence of the leader of my organization. And they woke up one morning and the combi was gone. And the gates had been forced and the thing was just gone. And nobody heard a thing. And so, that's just a good example of the kind of high levels of these carjackings that happened. Much more horrific was that South Africa had by far the highest rape rate in the world. And this carried over. This wasn't just in the inner cities. This carried over into the suburbs. I met multiple people in, for instance, the wealthy northern suburbs of Johannesburg, around Sandton or Randburg, or Gold Reef, who had been assaulted and in some cases raped by strangers just breaking into their homes. So it was a dangerous place, right? And this is just part and parcel of poverty and all of the other social ills that burdened South Africa in this period. This is one of the main obstacles that the Mandela presidency faced. South Africa's economy was stagnant already, and a lot of this had to do with the fact that whites had artificially inflated wages, and they had very secure positions, and there was a certain lack of qualified workers to fill skilled positions in some cases, and a lack of education, and so the number of factors made the economy fairly stagnant. Despite a lot of efforts to inject strength into the economy, the highest growth rate that the economy achieved, I believe, was in 1998, where the GDP grew at about 3.2%, which is that's okay. But given the fact that the Mandela presidency, as was understandable, sort of hinged their whole program of reform and growth on the notion that the economy would grow with injections of foreign capital and other things that the government was trying desperately to procure. That the economy remained fairly stagnant was not a good thing, and they were not able to accomplish a lot of what they wanted to do as a result. And by 1999, it was actually in recession again. The government did adopt a policy. The apartheid government had manipulated the currency in a number of ways, and I don't want to get into like the economics of monetary policy or anything like that. So don't worry, I'm not going to examine you or something on that. But they had kept the rand artificially high at times, and this is a problem if your economy relies very heavily on exporting goods to another country. Okay, because foreign currencies, if they don't stack up well against your currency, people are not going to be willing to invest. Well, Mandela and his economic advisors wanted to attract foreign investment, wanted to make South Africa competitive on a global scale. And coming out of sanctions, of apartheid, and things like this was a monumental challenge. And so they let the currency float against other currencies. They didn't try to manipulate it. And what this meant for South Africa was serious inflation. The value of the rand dropped steadily. When I first arrived in South Africa, right after Mandela's election, it was something like, I'm trying to recall, about 3.2 rands to the dollar, I believe. By the time I left, I think it was getting close to 5 rands to the dollar, and it would eventually drop to something like 15 rands to the dollar. And this meant that prices were rising precipitously. And I noticed this myself in the 2 years that I lived there. Again, sorry to use all these personal anecdotes, but I'm speaking from personal observation. That certain foods that I would buy on a fairly frequent basis. There was this wonderful fruit juice that was made from. South Africa has a burgeoning fruit industry. Lots of orchards in the Cape and things like this, and they make wonderful, wonderful fruit juice. I would buy this stuff called Liquifruit, and when I was initially there, a liter of Liquifruit cost something along the order of maybe 2 rands or maybe 2 rands 50. By the time I left South Africa, it was like 4 or 5 rands for a liter, and that it just was getting very difficult to buy even staple foods. Not that fruit juice is staple foods, but things were getting much more expensive over time, and this, of course, hurt the government's ability to fight poverty and things like this. The prices of staple commodities are rising. It's not, you're not going to be able to lift people out of poverty very easily. I mentioned the lack of qualified Africans. This is entirely the result of apartheid and its efforts to cut off opportunities for growth of black Africans. But it was nevertheless the case under the Mandela presidency. This went for things like the judiciary, it went for skilled labor positions, it went for the police force, any number of parts of the economy or of South African society. Blacks just lacked education and experience, and trying to find people to fill positions and do affirmative action was difficult. And so, many uneducated black Africans just remained in a difficult situation as a result of all of this. The government had a hard time with things like tax collection. Even at the end of the Mandela presidency, after some improvement, only about 70% of the taxes owed were actually collected. Which meant that government revenue was always less than anticipated, less than it should have been, and both the central government and especially provincial and municipal governments ran up huge debts. Some of these were left over from the kind of lack of care under the apartheid government, but some of them were new. As a result of efforts to improve the infrastructure. And so, these municipal debts were quite crushing in some cases and limited the ability of the government to be effective. The infrastructure of South Africa, this is one that I could go on and on about, right? The picture at the bottom here of the slide, bottom left, I think sums it up, right? Something like 10 million South Africans out of perhaps a population of 50 million, so maybe 20% of the population, lived in shacks like this, right? And a large percentage of those shacks had no um, fresh water being piped in. They had no sanitation infrastructure, no flush toilets, no sewage pipes. They had an outhouse out the back that, fell into a cesspit, as it were, right? This is an unhealthy environment, and in some cases, I saw families, extended families of 10 or 12, living in a two-room shack made of corrugated iron that was blistering hot in the summer and pretty cold in the winter, right? So this is something that the government simply could not get around, or had a very difficult time getting around. They tried to build subsidized housing, and after some fits and starts, they did succeed in building a fair number of houses for people to get them out of these unhealthy situations. But it was, of course, never enough, and the South African population continued to grow. The birth rate was fairly high, and so they never really caught up to the massive demand, or even made much of a dent in the massive demand for more services, more housing, and things like this. That, and the same goes for things like healthcare, right? I mean, I mentioned education, but the hospitals in the townships, and even in smaller towns, were really in horrific shape. They, the doctors and nurses did their level best. Some of them were underqualified, but hospital administrations were often corrupt. Thieves would come in and steal things out of the hospitals, medical equipment, clothing, the personal belongings of patients. I mean, it was really a sad situation with healthcare. And this in a country that had some of the most advanced hospitals and healthcare apparatus in the world for the white population under apartheid, right? So healthcare infrastructure was another one. Toward the end of the Mandela presidency, the AIDS crisis began to really dominate as a public health issue. It was estimated by the end of the 1990s that perhaps 1 in 5 of all South Africans were HIV positive. This is going to become much more of an issue under the Mbeki presidency, which we'll talk about later. But this is something the government was ill-equipped to handle, given all of these other massive challenges. So that paints a fairly bleak picture of the Mandela presidency. I just wanted to convey what a monumental task that Mandela and others in his government had before them, before I talk about some of the efforts and even some of the successes that they had. So I'll do that in the next lecture.